Hey, welcome to Genre Chat. I'm Caleb Walton, and tonight our guest is Miss Susan Baganz, and I'm so excited that that's your name when I read that online. That makes me so happy to be talking to you. Susan, on your website, you introduce yourself as an encourager, scribe, and silly mother of Hobbits, which makes the name so fitting. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you write and the different things you're involved
Well, what I write, I started out writing Regencies. And I know one of the questions you wanted to ask was, how did I get started writing, period? That started in 2009. I had a dream that God was telling me I should do National Novel Writing Month in November. So it's kind of interesting that we're doing this in October, because I had the dream in October. And November is National Novel Writing Month, nanowrimo.org. Hundreds of thousands of people sign up around the globe to write 50,000 words in 30 days. And I knew about it, but I'd never done it. And I had a story I'd always wanted to write and just never had the courage to do it. And I thought, okay, it's not illegal. It won't cost me anything. My kids are in school. What have I got to lose?
Being legal is always a plus. Being not illegal is always a plus when you're starting something.
Exactly. If it's illegal, then probably not a good thing to do. So I started to write what became the Virtuous Viscount, which was my first Regency. And I had 104 or 110,000 words within 21 days.
Wow.
Yeah. Now the book.
How did you manage? What was your daily word count like at that pace?
Sometimes I would hit 5,000. Occasionally I'd hit 10, but I just was on this wild roller coaster ride. But then there might be a day where I only got, 1,000. When you write big word counts, you can have a day where you don't do nothing and you're still okay. And I was hooked. Of course, I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. It was going to be, the most amazing book ever, until I realized that there were things like head hopping and point of view shifts and, and the fact that, that long of a novel is just too long for that genre. So
I remember that moment when I realized, go to your first writer's conference, and you're like, oh, I'm not Stephen King. No, not yet.
Yeah,
you had that realization of how much you don't know.
Exactly. So anyway, I started. I've done NaNoWriMo 8 years in a row now.
Wow.
And I've finished every time. Well, I got over 50,000 words. Only twice did I not finish the novel, and then I finished it in December. But then I started to write contemporaries, like in the spring. I wasn't doing NaNoWriMo or anything. I just would write. And I could still knock out a novel in, a month. 6 weeks at the most. So I started
making
writing.
me feel really bad about myself right now.
Yeah, sorry. And so I would start writing because I thought, I'll try my hand at contemporary, and I wanted to do a metaphor. So that novel was Pesto and Potholes. I have an affinity for these fun titles, and so I wrote that, and I wasn't really intending to do anything more with it. It was just kind of an exercise to see if I could do it. But that's evolved into an entire series as well. Nice. So, and it was actually the contemporaries that got published before the Regencies did.
Well, tell us a little more about the Regencies. First, what classifies Regency? Like, what's that time period where it qualifies as Regency England? And what is it that makes it Gothic? What's those characteristics that gives it that special twist?
Okay, well, the Regency period, of course, like you said, it's Great Britain. So it's United Kingdom. They have all these different lovely names for them for different parts of that area. So it takes place, the Regency period is where King George had gone mad. And there's actually a great movie called The Madness of King George. So if you want to see a historical movie, it's beautifully done, about his madness. You can kind of see what that culture was like. But he had gone mad, and his son, who is also George,
they like redundant names at the end.
King names his firstborn son George. So he petitioned to become regent, and it took a while for that to actually happen. So what it meant was that his father was incompetent to rule, and so he was the ruler, but he couldn't be called king because his father was still alive. So he's the regent. He's the prince regent, which is where you get the Regency period from. So he was made prince regent on February 5th, 1811. And then his father died January 29th, 1820. So that's the period that's known as Regency. Now, a lot of times it goes even to 1800 up to 1820. It's when the regent was known to be a man of excess. He was fat. He was very charming. No, he was very charming, but he blew money like crazy. He built this huge pavilion in London, or outside of London in Brighton, and it was called the Brighton Pavilion, and he'd have these lavish parties. And he wasn't really known to be a great ruler per se, but he was known for his excesses.
He was a popular one.
Well, I don't know about that, but they had to respect him because he was the ruler. But I think behind his back, a lot of people probably made fun of him too. And he made some bad choices. I won't get into those, but that's the Regency period. Okay. So when I started to write Regencies, I started to write kind of the Jane Austen, or Georgette Heyer is another great Regency author. I've loved her words, her books. There's many other Regency authors out there. Although to say it, Jane Austen wasn't a Regency author. She was actually a contemporary author.
In her day, that was a contemporary novel.
It was contemporary, but it was that Regency. So I started to write these stories, and then I had 5 of them, and I started to feel like as they went on, there was this evil that they were fighting. So then I had to go back to book 1. Book 1 got revised several times. It had a character that was taken out, plot lines removed, and then I had to amp up some of the suspense, because there was this character that emerged as I was writing the series that I had to introduce earlier on to tie the books together. So basically, Jane Austen's got that saying about how, a man with fortune is in want of a wife, right? So I'm like, okay, I got this little bug here. I've got these 4 guys who are really good friends. And so I'm like, okay, I got to get each one of them married off so they each have their story. I am a Christian, so I write inspirational romances. So, but Marcus initially, the virtuous Viscount, was the only one when I started out the series that was a Christian. And hence his virtue. And of course I had to call that into question, because what's the fun if you don't?
Exactly.
So it's kind of like when you look at, because Baganz, you look at the Lord of the Rings, and you have this overarching story, right? They break it up into 3 movies or 3 books, but there's this overarching story that goes on. So that's kind of what happens. Each book is a romance for that character, but there's overarching story that's going on with all the characters involved. Okay. And there's 5 books because Marcus had a brother, and he pops in and out periodically. He was serving with Wellesley as a aide de camp, basically a spy, a courier and a spy, and all that good stuff. So I decided that he had to be the final one, which is the one that just recently released, The Captain's Conquest, which actually was probably one of my favorites. So it's like Sir Michael's Mayhem and The Captain's Conquest. So book 3 and book 5 are probably my favorites out of the whole series. I don't know why. I just torture my characters mercilessly, and it's fun.
It's so much fun to ruin their lives.
It is. So because I added, so the Regency takes place within that time period, but the word Gothic comes from, if you listen to or read any of the Regency romances, there was an author at that time called Radcliffe, and she wrote Gothic romances. So these are the dark, spooky. If you look at Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey would probably be the closest that she's gotten to being Gothic. Where there's kind of this
and happy, a little bit more.
Yeah, you've got some darkness to it. You've got some spookiness to it. There's this overarching doom and gloom to it a little bit. So
the fog and
so anyway, so I had, which you have like with Lord of the Rings too. You've got this doom and gloom. You've got this horrible evil that they're fighting, and so that's kind of what happened in my book. They had this pretty much like a satanic figure, but he's actually a real human being. It's just that he really truly is in league with Satan in trying to take over Great Britain. So when I had gotten the books contracted, our publishing house was bought out by Pelican Book Group. So it had already been contracted. The contract moved to the new publishing house, but they hadn't been published yet. So when I was talking to my boss, because I'm an editor for them too, and I said, okay, these aren't your light, sweet, romances. These are a little darker. And she's like, ooh, Gothic. Oh, really? I write Gothic? I didn't even know. But yeah, I guess I shouldn't say that I can't write a sweet Regency, because I've done Christmas Regencies that tend to be sweet, and don't have that Gothic, doom and gloom to them. But I guess there's something kind of fun about having this evil force that they're fighting against, and it kind of permeates the books and intersects with all their lives, and then they finally get to defeat it at the end, which was a challenge.
Tell me a little about the romance element of it. I mean, that was totally different day, totally different customs. How is writing a contemporary romance and writing a Regency romance that's hundreds of years ago, how does that affect the relationships between the characters, the different cultures of the time?
Well, when you're writing a contemporary romance, they can pick up a phone and call somebody. They can get in a car and drive. They can, there's not a whole lot of restrictions on how men and women interact in our society, right? I mean, we have freedom to do a lot of things. And but in that time period, women and men, the rules and the mores prescribing their behavior was really rigid. And so, like, a woman could not write a letter to a man who was not related to her.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
No. And of course, they couldn't pick up a phone to call.
And well, that can make long distance relationships pretty tricky. Then I'm guessing.
Well, you really didn't have long distance. And now, if they were engaged, they might be able to communicate. So if somebody got engaged and then went to war, they might be able to exchange letters. But within that society, especially for the upper 10,000, which was the aristocracy, the more wealthy, titled people. You had these strict rules. So you couldn't dance more than typically twice at a ball with the same man.
Wow.
You couldn't be alone at all with them. And if
I remember in Jane Austen, one of the girls danced like 3 or 4 times with the same, and they were all panicking. Oh, wow, that's so spin. I remember reading that going, calm down.
It's tantamount. It's a tantamount to saying now we're going to get married. That's
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, so you have these restrictions on what you can do. So it's kind of fun to try to play them and throw them on their ear a little bit too. But so if a man was caught alone with a woman, he could be considered to have compromised her. If he kisses her, then yes, he's got to marry her. So
that makes the whole romance element so much more tense. And
yeah, I mean, romance, what's romantic about that? Now you're forced into a marriage with a woman you don't even know, or with a man you don't even know. And now you've got to, divorce was very uncommon during that time period. So it wasn't like you could get out of it very easily. I mean, not that it's easy nowadays, it's expensive. But it's definitely a whole lot easier than it was back then. It's far more heard of now than it is back then. And so, that being said, women could be in very, very difficult marriages because of that, and could be really victimized in a lot of ways. So that's, so to have a relationship like, so The Virtuous Viscount is Marcus and Josie's story. And that was kind of, Josie was already a believer. But when I wrote the second book, which is Lord Philip's Folly, there it is. Philip was not a believer, and I did put him in a compromising position. And so it's kind of interesting because I'm not your traditional romance author. Usually a romance starts, they meet, they have conflict, and then at the very end they might have their kiss, or they get married, or they're going to be engaged.
Yes.
But and it wasn't until the very end of The Virtuous Viscount that they did get married. But with Lord Philip's Folly, they actually get hitched pretty early. And that's when the real adventure begins for them. But they don't, and I've had people say that because it's even happened in my contemporaries. Well, but they just got married. What's going to happen now? I'm like, well, just because they got married doesn't mean they have their happily ever after, which is the hallmark of a romance. You have to end with that happily ever after ending. But if they're in the middle of fighting this life or death battle against an evil force, and they just got married, they don't even know each other. Now you've got a journey of them learning to get along, maybe love each other. And then because I'm a Christian, they've got their faith journey that goes along with that as they're fighting this battle. So every story is a little bit different in the tone and the way it takes, but there's always that evil force that's against them, which is true in our daily lives now. We just don't probably think of it the same way. The other thing that's different about regencies, as opposed to contemporary, is the way they express their faith. First of all, you would never use anything except for the King James Bible. That's all they had back then. And the way the Church of England was at that time, and the strictures on that, and a lot of that faith was a lot more formal. But you still had Wesleyanism coming in. You had Methodism starting. Calvin was around during that time period. You have William Wilberforce fighting the slave trade. You've got people who are believers. So there was a lot of pockets of revival in the middle of a lot of unrest, because England was at war with France at the same time. So there's all kinds of things that you can tap into, even spiritually, with the stories. And so that's, and obviously, like I said, the way that they express faith is very different. So there might be more scripture in my regencies, because they would do that. They would look at the scriptures and they would read them for comfort, probably more than we would. And you wouldn't probably see that as much in a contemporary romance. That would be considered more preachy to do that kind of thing.
Whereas back then it was contextually appropriate.
Correct. Exactly. So, and to talk about the differences between just knowing who Jesus Christ is and knowing him and having that relationship and that faith. But it's expressed differently, because they don't necessarily talk about it as a friendship kind of a thing. But yeah, so there's so many differences, and in the language itself is different too. So that's why I have a British actress reading my books for me for the Regencies, because I can't even pronounce half of those words. And it's weird when I hear them, to hear the way she'll enunciate them differently than we would as Americans.
You're like, wow, I read that.
Well, and it's like, that's how that's said in that country. So even some of the bigger name cities and stuff like that, I mean, I probably couldn't say them anywhere near the way a British person could. So I'd be tripping over, Gloucestershire, I'd be trying to put, it's kind of like Worcestershire sauce, like, how do you say Worcestershire sauce? They can shorten and condense things in some ways. And then there's others where, it's just the emphasis is on different letters or vowels. So it's kind of fun to hear that. She speaks in a little bit more of a regimented tone too, probably not as much dynamic in her reading as I would in my contemporaries when I record my contemporaries. But some of that might also be indicative of the genre too. People back then would have spoken in a far more level, not so energetic. They wouldn't have been expressing a lot of emotion, outwardly. Because it was a very restrictive society. At the same time, there was a lot of excesses going on behind the scenes and a lot of breaking of those rules. So I have a book called that Our Tempestuous Days. There was a lot of evil going on behind those refined exteriors. And so, which makes it kind of interesting to write on too.
So it's interesting that you said you work as an editor as well.
Yes.
What are some of the hallmarks of this genre that someone like an editor or an agent would expect to see? Some things that you want to make sure you include, different twists, or maybe just the general up and down flow of the story in this particular genre?
I think the general structure of a story is the same regardless of what genre you're writing in, especially even with a romance. But having said that, you would be looking for possibly some of the language of the day. You're not going to hear anybody in a Regency use the word okay. It's just not going to happen. I got a book here called English Through the Ages. It's a nice thick one, but I use this to look and see sometimes, okay, I want to use a word that describes something. How can I do that? And so some of the words, they use a lot of French back then too. They were at war with France, but they were also very enamored with French.
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, and I'm not French in any way, but I mean, I remember saying to a friend of mine, yeah, my character has NUI, and she goes, you mean ennui? And I'm like, I didn't know. I did not know. I'm such an idiot. But
I've got to use that.
NUI. But yeah, so they have terms like point non plus, and they've got other words that are specific to that era that can add more color to the language, and you can also write with a larger vocabulary than you can contemporary. So it's kind of fun to be able to play with the language a little bit more, because they definitely, there's a John, I think it's John Branyan or Banyan, I get his name wrong. He's a comedian. He does, if you can look it up on YouTube, he does a little thing on the Three Little Pigs, and how even back in Shakespeare's day, the vocabulary was so robust that even now he wouldn't be able to recite.
I've seen that. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, in high school, my Shakespeare teacher showed that video, and it was hilarious. It was awesome.
It is. He's like, I couldn't even read a fairy tale to my kids because I wouldn't know how to use the language. So it's an example of, just how fun, and not that I'm writing Shakespearean type words, but just how much more robust the language is back then. So it's kind of fun to be able to play with, maybe not to be intellectual, but to play with a wider variety of language and terms and words, which as a writer is just kind of fun to do. Whereas and if you're writing contemporary, you can't do that so much, because people don't want to be stopping to look at a dictionary. In Regency, those who read that genre know the words.
Exactly.
You don't have to have, and if you make it, if it's good enough, the context will tell you what it is.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
How did you go about doing research for all this? Because there's something between the cultures and the language and the setting. And all. How did you go about doing that kind of research?
Well, I think first of all, I read, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books in the genre. That helped. And obviously I do like Jane Austen's work, and I enjoy her her movies. Yeah, I enjoy her movies. She made movies. I enjoy her writing. And so when you look at that, that alone is great research. But then you do go online and you do look up stuff. I've got, different books just about like even the clothing of the era. And, how do you describe, reticule would be a purse, a red goat would be a jacket. The Empire waist gowns was what they typically wore. But there's different color schemes and different ways that they would do them. So if you want to get into the fashion of it, the chip bonnet and stuff, it's so different from what we have. So there's a lot of resources online now. I do have a lot of books. Some of them are ebooks. Some of them are actual physical books that I have about that era, so that I can do that research. I've got a book that just talks more about the culture of that day, and how that all played out. I haven't gone into the politics as much, but there's the Whigs and the Tories and how that all plays in. I'm not writing a political book, so I might refer to that, but I'm not. And it's just more as to ground it in the history. So some people write historicals, which I have a very historically based story, and then there's a romance thrown in. I write romances that have a historical backdrop.
Exactly.
So that's kind of the difference.
It's just to help immerse the reader more in the environment.
Right, because it's kind of fun to lock it into a date and a time, and to maybe reference something that really did happen back then, or maybe a character that was really around back then, or maybe it comes into a conversation. Well, did you hear about what Prince George did now, or the Regent did now? That kind of thing. So that people get a feel for that, just the culture, the richness, that it's more than just these characters on the page. There's this whole world that's going on behind them, and it makes you feel like it's real, not just some made up fairy tale story. Now, having said that, as an editor, one of the things that I will get most angry about if somebody's writing a Regency, and I've not encountered it with anybody that I've contracted for a Regency, and I haven't edited a lot of them, but I've read so many, and I like the genre, that I've had them where they've tried to say that the woman is, worried about losing her inheritance, and she can't wait to become, a countess when her dad dies, kind of thing, which is kind of like, okay, if you've ever watched Downton Abbey, which is grounded in England.
Yes.
Okay, the whole premise of the story is, right, no, that's fine. The whole premise of the story, as it starts out, is he needs to have an heir so that the house stays within the family, because he only has daughters. The daughters cannot inherit the land. They cannot inherit the title. And so it's a very well-known fact of the aristocracy and the way things went with the way things are inherited, that you can't do that. And I mean, gosh, I've got a huge folder, like this thick, just of stuff I've printed off online about titles and how you refer to people. And so all that stuff has to be correct, because somebody who knows that genre is going to know that it's wrong.
Exactly.
And so
and then that takes away your credibility for the rest of the story if you get something.
Exactly. Now, I just wrote a book for Christmas, and my editor-in-chief, who was my editor on it, she's written Regencies before, and she used to live in England. So she has that background. Yeah.
So I bet she has a really good grasp of the way the dialogue works and stuff like that.
She has an awesome grasp on it. So she'll catch things that I miss. Like I was writing this Doctor's Daughter. It's called The Doctor's Daughter. It's a Christmas novella coming out at the end of November. And I had to be careful because I didn't realize that it was actually illegal for a woman to practice as a physician during that time period.
Wow.
I knew that it wouldn't be an acceptable practice, but that it was actually illegal. So how do I write a woman who maybe has to step in and actually do something to save somebody's life and make it acceptable within that time period?
Exactly.
Without, making somebody who knows that well going, no, she couldn't do that.
Exactly.
So that's the thing you have to walk. It's like, how can you make this realistic and maybe bend some of those rules a little bit, but make it believable that you can do it.
Exactly.
I have in my first book, I have a guy who's sitting at night praying by the bedside of the woman that, is unconscious. Well, Kate, now is he compromising her? No.
Exactly. And you got to keep in mind where you can get away with that and where you can't.
So he has a maid in there the whole time. He's never alone with her, kind of a thing. So that allows him that freedom to go in and pray or maybe talk to her very softly when she finally does wake up. It's kind of hard to write a character who's unconscious. It just doesn't work very well. And so, so yeah, you kind of have to play around with that stuff. But when it comes to titles and inheritance and that kind of stuff, you have to be spot on. There's no,
because they will catch it. Because I'm guessing the people in that genre, they know their stuff. The fans of that genre, they know the facts. They know the history.
Yep. And I've seen books. I don't write reviews if they're a bad book usually, but I did come across one that had that was like the whole plot line. And I did write a review because I'm like, this is not
There's just too much. There's just too much to critique.
If this author had made it a fantasy, had created this new world, a different land that didn't really exist, and she's a princess or whatever, that's fine. But then you can make up your own rules. But if you're setting it in England during that time period, you got to adhere to the rules of the time period. You cannot get away with anything else. So
I want to talk for just a minute about your writing process, especially after hearing the word count that I'm super, super jealous of.
I've never written that many words in that much short a time again. So
do you only do that during NaNoWriMo, or do you do it can you do 5,000 words a day, just throughout the year?
I don't. Okay. So I'm not one who writes every day, and actually I haven't written for a long time just because I've been editing and I had shoulder surgery and it's my right arm and I'm right-handed. So
so that destroys everything
I couldn't use a computer. I couldn't type. I couldn't hardly write. My fiance would be like, "Is that your penmanship?" I'm like, "Yes, that's my penmanship." No, I can't read a thing I put down. But it's better now. I'm 10 weeks post-surgery and
that's
I
awesome.
can type again and I can write again. But I write fast during NaNoWriMo. I can write fast if I put myself to it. It's I think that's what it is you really have to set out that you're going to do this. But having said that, I might have a day where I write 5,000 words. The next day I might write 63.
Exactly.
How
long does it take you usually to get that much on the paper? On the screen. Is it like a whole all day thing, or do you just like to blast it on the page and then go back and edit and straighten out sentences and stuff like that?
Well, during NaNoWriMo, the rule is you turn off your inner editor. And so
that would be hard.
The only time I go back is the next morning. I might go back and read what I wrote the day before so that I can continue on. I am, like you said, organic, or I like to call a pantster. I do not plot out my novels. I let the story take me where it's going to take me. The characters kind of take over for me. Having said that, I will hit every single novel, every single one, I will hit what I call a wall of fear. I don't call it a writer's block because I really think it's fear. I feel like I have just written the biggest piece of crap there is. This is the most awful novel ever. Yeah. Nobody's ever going to want to read this. I've written myself into a corner. I can't see where I'm going to go from here. And once I realized that it was fear, I don't even think I realized how much fear drove my life until I started writing.
Wow.
And then it just kind of hit me in the face that I was afraid. And every single full-length novel, I've had this happen. And usually if I do NaNoWriMo, it's always the second week. Doesn't matter how many words I have on a page. It'll always be the second week that I'll hit that. So I know it's coming. And every time
that's good for me, and everyone else is still like coming up in the industry to know that, hey, even people who have been published, who have been in the business for years, they have that moment where I can't write anything. Oh, this is dribble. You have
exactly.
Better how successful you are.
Exactly. For me, I pray. I may get up and do something else. I may go for a walk. I may not write the rest of that day when I hit that, but then the next day I force myself to write. Because you can always delete words off a page, but I don't know that I ever have. And I could not tell you in any one of my novels where that spot was. I don't know where it was. Wow. And I read my books and I'm like, I love my stories and I will read my own books and I will just enjoy them as much as when I wrote them. And I could never tell you where that spot is.
That is interesting because I actually I had the privilege of interviewing Lynette Eason a few months ago. And I asked her, I said, Lynette, do you ever sit down and read your books? Do you ever flip? And she said, I have never read a piece of my writing after it's on the shelf because I will self-edit and I will go back and I will think, oh, I should have done that this way and done that way. And I've always, is that a universal thing or do some people actually, can they sit down and read it? And that's interesting that you said that you actually read your works. Well, what is that like?
I didn't initially do that. Of course, now that I'm recording audiobooks for my contemporaries, I'm reading them. And then with my regencies, I'm having to proof the books. So I'm actually going through them again. I'm not actually reading them. I usually just listen and then I have to go back to the book if there's an error and then correct it. But you do find mistakes and you do always see how you could have done something better. And I've just had to come to a point, like with Captain's Conquest, I found like one section where I could have deleted an entire line. It felt redundant. I'm like, why did I write that? And then I found a homophone. You have a word that's spelled differently, but it sounds the same. It was the wrong word.
You want to go in there with a pen and just scratch it out and write it.
And I just thought, I told my boss, I said, it's not worth trying to go in and fix it for future, printings. But I said, the good news is that if anybody orders the audiobook, they're never going to know, because it sounds the same. And we do that when we type, I think, and you have so many different eyes looking at it, and you just have to realize, and when I teach classes, I just actually taught a class at the university here on, it was called the Fiction Writer's Toolbox. And one of the things I said is you just need to accept that you're going to make mistakes and that mistakes are going to get into your novel. Sometimes I like to think there's like a pixie in my computer messing up with things because how did that get in there? And you have to have a little bit of a sense of humor about it. And you hope and pray that your story is so riveting that even the most hardened grammar Nazi is going to be willing to overlook those things and just keep on reading. And because that's what, you got people that'll get so nitpicky about that stuff and it'll ruin a story for them. You don't want that, but it's just going to happen. Things are going to go wrong. You're going to have, I've had it where there's like an extra period. Like, where did that come from? Who cares? You know what? It's the least of my worry. The book is out. It's done. You just can't go back and
release it into the world.
And you just have to realize that, even the big publishing houses who have their amazing editors and proofreaders and all that kind of stuff, mistakes will still probably show up in that manuscript. And the fact is, I've read that book so many times, you can't always see those clearly. By the time it comes out in print, I haven't read it for a while, so I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. And so, it's going to happen. Things are going to pop up, and you just have to learn to roll with it and just go, you know what? It's not the end of the world. There are worse things out there that can happen to you than have a word that's misspelled in your book.
Amen.
Or a word that's missing, or a word. It's going to happen in spite of your best efforts. And so if you can just take a deep breath and go, you know what? I used to work in the production booth at our church, and we'd have mistakes happen. You know, like maybe a slide was wrong for the worship songs, or maybe a cue was missed with the lighting or something. And we get to the end of the day, and I would just be like, you know what? Nobody died. Nobody lost a limb. It's all good. You know, because when it's done, you can't go back and undo it. You know, you're past that moment. So you just have to give yourself some grace and hope that the reader will give you that same grace.
I love it. Well, Susan, I've had such a good time talking with you and learning more about the genre. I really didn't know a lot, but I'm interested to read some of your work and, you know, get kind of lost in that world.
Yeah.
Before we go, if anybody wants to learn more about your books or different things that you do, or want to maybe contact you for any reason, where's a good place for them to go and do that?
Probably the best place would be my blog, susanbaganz.com. So it's SusanBaganz.com.
You spell it different than the Hobbits do. That's the one.
You know, and I'm going to be getting married in December, so my name's going to change, but I'll still be publishing under that. So
you can't let go of a last name like Baggins. You can't. You have to hold on to that.
My fiance was like, "Are you going to change your name?" And I said, "Well, when I go to when we're writing, it's not going to change. When I go to writers' conferences, I'll add your name to my publishing name." And I said, "But for everything else, I'll have your last name." And he's like, "Oh, okay, I can accept that." So.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us. I really enjoyed having you. I hope we can have you back again sometime.
That would be lovely. I would love it.
Okay. Well, thank you for watching Genre Chat, and we will see you guys next time.